Sir, so it is written here in the very first page that the increasing distance between Sanskrit and modern Indian languages and the need to receive new literatures being written in languages of the world other than English have made it imperative for us to have an enormous volume of translated literary work at hand.
Okay. So we need a lot of translations. That's what it says, right? But why do you need an Indian perspective? You are right.
So, like Indian perspective, because first of all, the dominance of English can also be. I mean, there is a need to look at other languages and the literatures of other languages, and which will only be possible if it is translated, because other people don't know our language. So our culture will also come forward, and because India has a lot of these things to offer, and also
No,
we
no,
have a
that
lot
is
of.
perfectly fine. Yeah, that is perfectly what you are saying is right. But how does it justify need for Indian perspective on translation theory? What's wrong with Western theories? He's saying that the lot of Indian literature is coming into translation, coming through translation. Then we need an Indian theory. Why? But वेस्टर्न थियोरी से तो आप काम चलाते हो, आपका लिटरेरी क्रिटिसिज्म के पेपर are all Western theories.
But sir, if we don't understand Indian theories, how would we understand Indian literature? If we don't understand the importance of Indian aesthetics that we use uh, excessively in the making of Indian literatures, if that is not understood, then how would we understand this literature to larger extent?
Correct. So in case of translation, what you're talking about literature, right? In order to understand Indian literature, you have to understand Indian aesthetics. But I am saying, then translation, why do you need an Indian perspective?
Because maybe so. Sir, can you please repeat your question once again?
My question is, why do you need an Indian perspective or Indian translation theory? Western translation
maybe
theories that you study, what's wrong with them?
because sir, the way the West translates, so the translation theory in the West was derived from their literatures. I mean, we cannot possibly fit our way of writing, our way of expressing in their skeleton of translation.
Okay, can you say something more about it? You are right.
I mean, so when I read this, I mean, I just read this from upar se thoda sa, but it is clearly mentioned that here, and it also gave me an idea about it a little bit. That so what happens is when we uh, here it is written that there is a translation is in an exile, and an exile is in metaphorical translation in the West. So I don't understand particularly the meaning of this statement, but what I understood is that translation was taken as something in isolation, in exile, but we a Hindu spirit which belongs to a multilingual nation would would not possibly be able to, the form of our literatures would not possibly be able to translate it uh, in their way. I'm not sure, sir. But I
Okay.
just have a basic idea. I'm not sure how to
Okay.
express it.
Anyone else wants to try?
So I'm not sure, but is it also possible that translations in the West had its origin in it being a curse or consequences of something which was seen as a sin. And translations in I'm not sure East or India, for example, was not seen as it was seen in the West. So our perspective is very different from how West see the translations.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why is that our perspective? Why does it become necessary then?
But as Bahini said before, na, like it is necessary because we are reading our literature. So to understand India's multilinguistic literature, which has literature from all different languages, we need our own theories to look at it. We need our own translation theories, which is different from Western theories, to look at our literature.
Okay, very good. That means what she is saying is that our perspective, our take on translation was very different from the Western understanding of what translation is. And so when you are looking at a great growth in Indian translations from Indian languages, which Dehini pointed out, enormous amount of translated literary work is at hand. In such a situation, we need an Indian perspective to understand Indian literature in English translation, because our perspective was very different from the Western one. Secondly, to understand Indian literature in English translation, you require an Indian perspective. The Western perspective is not going to fit because it is very different. And that is the reason why you need an Indian theory of translation. Right? Very good. Now, what are the differences between the Western approaches to translation and Indian approaches to translation? According to Devi.
So your question is, how is Western translation different from Indian translation?
Approach to translation.
Okay.
Or view or perspective, Western perspective on translation, different from Indian perspective on translation.
I have not read this whole essay. However, I was going through it right now. There's this, one second, there's this page, third page, second paragraph, where they say translation was a heresy and protest not only during Renaissance Europe, and they take it back to the Plato times and Aristotle times. And below that paragraph, they talk about Bhakti movement in India and how in Bhakti movement people wanted to translate from the Sanskrit language to different languages. So that is like one difference on how it was approached.
Very good. Very good. That is one important difference, right? That in the West it was heresy and protest, but in Indian context it was more of a wanted and positive thing, right? In Indian context, translation was something that was needed. Correct. What else? You are right. This is one important difference. Is there any other difference? Do you agree with this position which Devi is saying?
Which one, sir?
Ones that we discussed till now regarding translation theory. His position is that we need an Indian perspective on translation because Western perspective is very different, and that there is a lot of Indian literature in English translation coming up. So we need an Indian perspective on translation. Is that something that you agree with or you don't? How many of you would agree with what Devi is saying? Raise your hands. And how many of you would disagree? Rushi agrees. Dehini agrees?
I agree, sir.
Yeah. Pooja, Nisha, char log. What about others? Sazal, Yotima, Khadija, Richa, Riva, and Shreya. What about you? Yeah, Dehini and Rushi, why do you think this is a correct position? Rushi?
Because, sir, to understand our own literature and culture, we are borrowing from others to understand it, right? But we need to eliminate that middle man to get closer to our own culture. That's what.
Which is that middleman?
Western understanding, Western methodology.
Okay. Would you think this would apply also to literature? Whatever literary theory and criticism that you study in your BA and MA, how would you relate that? If you are trying to study Indian literature, then would you study Indian literary criticism and theory, or would you study Western literary theory and criticism?
Indian literary theory, sir.
Why do you think that should be the case, or is the case?
Because, sir, first of all, literary theory is basically something that we have been following. These theories are something that we have been following since ages, and the literature produced are a result of this understanding of ours. So if we are fully want to understand particular literature, we have to also understand this theory on the basis of which this literature has been produced.
Right.
So for a greater understanding, we cannot use the logic of Western literary theories in ours. So that wouldn't make any. That would not help us understand something from a complete perspective. From as a whole.
Right. Yeah, Rishi. Correct. What the initial saying makes sense. Yeah. Rishi.
But, sir, won't we need to learn both of them? I mean, Western
Do you think
theory
so? Why do you
and
need
Indian
to learn
theory,
both
because sir, the concept of theory itself is Western, right? I mean, we have.
You mean Indians never had a theory?
We have theory, but sir, this looking at the world like epistemology and ontology, and all of these concepts were given by the Western world, right? So
is it? In India, we didn't have concepts of epistemology and ontology.
Sir,
What do you think?
I don't know if any Indian sages or any Indian people have given their own concept.
And again, if you look at it, what do you even mean by the term Indian? Dehini, Rushi, Pooja. What do you think? What do you mean by Indian theory? What is Indian? What makes a theory Indian? What makes something Indian?
Sir, whenever you ask this question, it gets back to that discussion where we were all geographically very confused.
Geographically confused.
I mean, we did not know which region to call. You made us even doubt our own countries,
Yeah,
what we have and everything. So,
right. So what we mean by India is a complex idea, right? It's not simple. So even if we believe that we need an Indian theory, we are not very clear of what we mean by Indian, right? It's a tricky domain. For example, Devi gives an example of Bhartuhari's idea of fort on page number, where is it? 147. And he says that Bhartuhari gives his theory of sport. This is the first chapter. He says that Nadasya karmajata van purvo na parascha sa, and it goes like this, that since the phonetic manifestation is sequential, language expresses itself in a sequentially graded body, though in itself it is without a sequence in terms of pre and post. The relation between nad, that is phonetic manifestation, and sport, that is the semantic realization, is like between reflection of something in flowing water and stream, a reflection which is of steady object but acquires the movement of the stream. As knowledge reflects its nature as well as the nature of the giver of that knowledge, so does phonetic signs reflect their forms as well as the forms of significance. That is the first, that's one of the statements by Bhartuhari, from which Devi wants to imply that using such notions of meaning and words, signifier and signified, we can construct a theory of translation that is better than the conventional theories of translation, which deny the possibility of translation itself, right? But the problem with Devi's argument is that Bhartuhari belongs to what? 4th, 2nd century BC, right? When the idea of India was not the same as what we have today. Right? So can we call Bhartuhari Indian? That becomes a problem. And then he uses it in comparison with Derrida's statement on signifier and signified, and Derrida's position that there is no such thing like original. And what is considered original is also a translation in some sense. So he's trying to put these two things together, bring two things together in a comparative way, right? To highlight the fact that we can come up, India can come up with a better theory of translation, which is relevant to Indian context. That is what he is trying to say. But so what would make Bhartuhari Indian is still not very clear, right? What do we mean by Indianness of Bhartuhari? So this whole dichotomy between West and East is very simplistically given at times, which we need to be seriously thoughtful about. Yeah, Dehini.
So I had this question. I'm a little confused. So what do you mean by? So we understood how the theory of translation was created, and what was the purpose in the West and the East. But I just don't understand how perspectives in a translation would be different. Translation and interpretation is just a simple process of understanding something or one's culture, or I mean the position of the text, and interpreting it in a different language. So how this process is different for the West and the East? I mean, yes, the purpose can be different, but how the perspective can be different? I just don't understand that.
The example which Pooja has given, for example, translation was understood as a protest and a heresy in Renaissance. Right? And there were people who were put to death for mistranslation. It was seen as a sign of protest. Right? And we discussed the whole myth of Babel. Right? How God's curse resulted in necessity of translation because God did not like man's hubris. We discussed that, right? So if you look at this mythology of Bible, if you look at Plato's theory of imitation, if you look at romantic theories of art, which privilege genius, as Lefebvre points out, right? All this would see translation as a derivative activity or something which is not positive. Either an inferior activity, subordinate activity, a marginal activity, or something which is required, a necessary evil because of the curse of Babel. Right? So the idea of translation cannot be understood outside this history of Western thought. Similarly, in the context of Indian knowledge systems, various kinds, you don't find that kind of animosity or that kind of negative attitude towards translation. And in fact, he would go on to argue that translation, Bhakti movement was itself a movement of translation of language of spirituality from Sanskrit to languages of people. Right. So our approach, our understanding of translation has to be understood in the context of Indian knowledge system and Indian traditions of thought. Right? Does that make any sense to you, Dehini?
Yes, sir, clear.
Because Western perspective, as you are saying, to the question of translation has a history which considers translation as a negative act or a subordinate act or a marginal act. Such kind of history does not exist in India. In fact, he would say, if you look at page, I will come to your question, Rushi, once a minute. He says that in India, we believe, where is this? In transmigration and transformations of all kinds. Where is that? I'm not able to pinpoint that. But what he says that Indians believe in birth and rebirth, right? By which he means Hindus. That allows a possibility of very different kind of afterlife. All life is afterlife, right? In India. Does that make any sense? So our metaphysics is not hostile to the idea of translation because translation undergoes transformation. This transformation is not considered as a bad thing, but seen as part of life. Right? So here he says on page 1, an Indian student of literature finds himself precariously hanging between a literary metaphysics which rules out the very possibility of translation. And this literary metaphysics is the Western metaphysics. While the literary ethos, that means the culture in which you are living, is being shaped by translation. Translation is getting more and more important in the culture you live, but the theory that you have taken from West rules out possibility of translation. And that is one of the primary reasons why we need to develop an Indian perspective of translation. That is a summary of this essay. And then he goes on to point out all the, he says that in the West, translation was compared with a kind of lapse, right? Unparadise, and the diaspora of Jews. So when J. Hillis Miller says translation is wandering existence in a perpetual exile, right? That is the perception, Western perception of translation. So man or Jews who are being deprived of their homeland, right? They have to wander all over the planet, and God has made a covenant with them that you will get your holy land back. So all this mythology, right, comes into play when people start theorizing translation like Hillis Miller does. Does anyone know who is Hillis Miller? J. Hillis Miller? Have you heard of his name? Where have you heard of his name? Okay, have you read Paul de Man? Harold Bloom? Right, these people are called Yale deconstructionists. This is a Yale School of Deconstruction. So J. Hillis Miller is one of the important theorists associated with Yale School of English Studies in that period. So these four American scholars, J. Hillis Miller, Paul de Man, Harold Bloom, and I forget, Jeffrey Hartman. These four scholars were labeled as Yale hermeneutic mafia or Yale deconstructionists. They were deeply influenced by the writings of Heidegger and Derrida. Translation is the wandering existence in perpetual exile is his Hillis Miller's statement that it never finds its home. Translation has never found its home because it is a kind of diaspora and exile. It is wandering, bhatak raha hai. Beghar ho chuka hai aur bhatak raha hai, right? So this kind of negativity associated with translation is missing on Indian subcontinent's intellectual history. And he talks about how Indian consciousness is a kind of translating consciousness, page 135. Why? Because all of us are almost multilinguals with 3 languages at least. You can speak 3 Indian languages or 3 languages that you can speak. So in the course of one sentence, you change, you switch your codes, and that makes us multilingual people. So our consciousness or our awareness is not monolingual like that of the West. So Western theories are based on that monolingual consciousness, right? And that's why they can never accept translations as a possibility even. While Indian consciousness is a translating consciousness where multilingualism is a way of life. It is banal way of life. You use 3 languages every time you open your mouth. So it's not a big deal in India to be multilingual. It's ordinary. So our ethos, which is multilingual, our metaphysics, which accepts rebirth and transformation, right, cannot have the same perspective on translation as the Western theory has. That's his argument. Yeah, Rushi, you wanted to say something from a long time.
Yeah, sir. So I wanted to ask that even if we don't have, even if we didn't have this aversion to translation, inherent aversion to translation, didn't we also have this Puritan thought of Sanskritizing everything? Like,
Yes.
for example, uh, Hemchandra also said in his Kavyanushasana that everything should be in either Sanskrit or the other two derivative languages of Sanskrit.
So
So didn't it also discourage translation?
what do you think? Did it? Did it discourage translation?
I mean, not in the vernacular languages. I mean, like translating from Gujarati to Marathi, it it I think it was basically uninterrupted, but still, wasn't there like classism that those who write in these three languages were elites and the other were vernaculars? Or
Again, I think you need to bring in some history to clarify what you are saying. Hemchandracharya is 12th century, right? And he talks about, he doesn't say that, he says that Kavya can be written in three languages: Sanskrit, Apabhransh, and Prakrit, right? And the language that was spoken by people was kind of vernacular that is derived from Apabhransh and Prakrit, right? Jainas used to compose in that. So what you say about idea of purity and refinement, that is definitely true, but that is not, what is not true is that it discouraged translations, because entire history of Gujarati, Marathi, Bengali, Tamil languages is of substantial amount of translations from Sanskrit into vernaculars, right? And often from vernaculars to Sanskrit. For example, Panchatantra or Hitopadesh or even Mahabharata. These are the stories that probably circulated in vernaculars like Prakrit and Apabhransh. Prakrit, Apabhransh were vernaculars, right? Which were later on collected in Sanskrit, codified in Sanskrit. So there was a kind of give and take between Sanskrit and vernacular. But what has not happened is that Tulsi Ramayana is not seen as inferior version of Valmiki Ramayana. Tulsi Ramayana occupies extremely important part in the life of North Indian people, right? It is much more important than what Paradise Lost would be for British people. It is everyday performance of Tulsidas. Even today, if you have seen the boards of Sundarkand, then Sundarkand is one of the episodes of Ramayana, especially in Tulsi Ramayana, where Hanuman visits Lanka. Now that is, there are many lectures, pravachans and performance of that even today happening in India. Tulsi Ramayana is a religious book, right? It is considered sacred, but it is a retelling of Valmiki Ramayana. And there are hundreds of other Ramayans which are retellings of the Valmiki Ramayana or the Ram story. Now, do you think this is a discouragement for retelling in other language?
no, sir.
Right. But if you wanted to do that to the Bible, then what would happen is what happened to Etienne Dole and other people in the protest, in the Reformation, where they were persecuted for translating Bible into English. Now, Bible itself is a translation from the Hebrew and Aramaic and many other Jewish languages. It's brought into Latin, right? Now, Latin is considered a superior language in the West. It's ecclesiastical language of religious clergy and all that. So it gets that superiority when it is brought to Sanskrit, that is of the West, that is Latin, right? From the vernaculars, maybe Hebrew or Aramaic or multiple languages of Middle East. Now, if it is brought into English, it was considered as heresy. Why? Because you cannot tamper with God's words. So Protestantism, which translated Bible into English and other vernaculars, was an act of defiance, right? And there was a negativity associated with it. Yes, right, Wycliffe, and probably Wycliffe was also persecuted. I'm not very sure. So I think there is a long essay on all persecution of Bible translators in the West. Etienne Doulé on page 136 was the first theorist of translation in French, probably, or in vernaculars. When I say vernaculars, I mean French, German, English. Your vernaculars, right? Don't. So English becomes an elite language in India, but in the West, it is a vernacular. So Doulé was crucified, or some of them were burnt at stake. In India, no such thing happened. आपने भगवत गीता गुजराती में लाए हो तो आपको जला दिया जाएगा, ऐसे नहीं हुआ. So our approach to translation was more open compared to that of West. That is what he is arguing. It may not be absolutely open, but relatively more broad-minded approach to translation, where it was not expected that translation should be a literal version, but a freer creative retelling was accepted as translation in India. So you can see the approaches to translations were different. Rushi, you have so many retellings of Ramayana, Mahabharata, Gita in Indian languages, modern Indian languages. So they were not punished for that.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anything else you have to say? And then he compares the history of translation. Yeah, go ahead.
So, sir, there is another thing that after it is related to the European region, right? So, let's say after the World War II, didn't they form a kind of cohesive European Union? And didn't they compensate?
Who?
The European.
Okay. Which utopian vision are you talking about? After World War?
The European, not utopian.
Okay. Yeah, so
didn't they compensate for whatever they lacked in terms of translation theory?
Not really. Not really. Look at the history of translation in the West he has given. page 136. So translation in Renaissance was a diachronic activity. That means it was across the time. So the older texts of past, largely classics, were translated into vernaculars, that is English, German, French. So this is the diachronic nature of Renaissance translations. So they would translate Plato and Aristotle and Longinus and Horace and Ovid and Virgil and Homer into into vernacular languages like English. So this is the first phase of translation in modern European literature. The second was synchronic. That is, they translated from cultures other than theirs. So they would translate from China, India, Arabia, and this was the Orientalist project, the synchronic phase. Synchronic means in the same time. So they were not translating from the past, but they were translating from across the cultures. And the third phase is a comparative phase. That's what he says. So nationalism and colonialism have influenced the last phase of translation. And if you look at the page number 137, here is translation of Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam into English by Fitzgerald, one of the most famous translations from Persian. And what Fitzgerald said was, it is better to have a live sparrow than a dead eagle. Devi has not quoted it. I am just telling you what Fitzgerald has said. And he believed that the Persians were culturally inferior to them. Advanced Western Victorian civilization, while Persians were backward. Why? Because of many things. One of the things was they were writing love poetry. Men were writing love poetry to other men. The whole Saki business. Saki is a wine bearer, right? Saki was male and often boy, in whose praise Persian poets and Arabic poets composed their love poetry. So it was homoerotic, and that would not suit the Western taste. And that's why they modified it to suit their advanced, progressive civilization. So, and there was a touch of arrogance in whatever Fitzgerald did, right? So this Orientalist phase is marked by this assumptions of cultural superiority and the politics of colonialism, right? And the last phase after decolonization was comparative study के अंदर में आता था. It was part of comparative literature. So these were three important strands in Western history of translation in the West. Yeah, so Rushi, what is your question in this context?
So, sir, now the Europe is so much more united and so much closer than before, right? So, for example, in Schengen region, you can move around freely in multiple countries of Europe. So, wouldn't it make more sense to have a very positive outlook towards translation?
But it has not changed
Now.
much. Means if you look at what some scholars have said, hardly 10% of publications and that is on higher side, of publications in English in the West are translations. right? So there is still not enthusiasm for other literatures because it's believed that our literature and our literary taste and our own cultural assumptions, our own poetics are the best. We need not look for how other people write. That has not changed much. There is an improvement, but not major change. That is what people say. And what you talk about Europe being a unified state, right? Then it is still Eurocentric. No? I hope you get what I'm saying. They're talking about united Europe, which is also a fiction because Britain has withdrawn from European Union, Brexit, and I think even Greece has withdrawn. But point is, Eurocentrism, unification of Europe does not mean leaving Eurocentrism, but actually maybe supporting it. That is a possibility. So having united Europe does not mean that they are willing to look beyond Europe. I hope you get that. Their interest in African, Chinese, Indian, Persian, Iraqi, Japanese literature is not as high as their own literatures.
Yes, sir.
There would be a Chinese expert, an Indian expert, but people would not be interested in reading Chinese literature and Indian literature. African expert, area expert. Yeah, any other question?
Sir, I had a small doubt. You asked us to define what is Indian or what is Indianness, right? And I have no answer, like what is Indian or what can be some called Indian. So how do I then know that this particular thing falls under Indian literature or this Indian literary theory has to be used on this literature because it is Indian
How
literature?
I look at it is in this way. India, what do you mean by Indian? If you consider it nation state as a category, then it is modern, right? So if you define Indianness in terms of nation state, then it's fairly modern. But if you look at India as more of civilizational and cultural space, which may include Bangladesh and Pakistan and Sri Lanka as well, then that would be another way of looking at Indian literature. That you see that as civilization rather than nation state and identity, you look at it as a cultural space. Does that help you?
So it depends on how we are defining it, right? So if it's a nation state, it would probably
Yeah,
be
and the idea of nation state draws upon this civilizational history to define itself. Right?
So when we talk about nation state, is it like after colonization, like
After colonial, yeah.
and if we talk about this cultural or cultural space and civilization, it is including all other different countries now.
Yeah.
Okay.
You cannot limit yourself to a particular nation because what we call maybe some of the earliest Rigved and Vedic texts were composed in what is today's Pakistan, right? I hope you get that. Indus Valley civilization is now part of what is today called Pakistan. So as a civilizational and cultural space, cultural geography, right, then it would be going beyond nation state. That's why some people use South Asia as a area term, which means, so because if you look at, if you are studying history of Urdu literature, then you cannot say that I will study only history of Urdu literature in India. Pakistan and Bangladesh would as much important role in Urdu literature, or Punjabi literature in Pakistan, or Sindhi literature in Pakistan would be equally important, right? As Sindhi literature in for sale in Indian subcontinent only, yes. So civilizational geography is one way of thinking about it. And you have to understand that modern Indian nation state defines itself by drawing upon these histories for itself. It constructs its national identity by drawing upon these histories of pre-colonial, pre-state, pre-Indian India. I don't know if I have helped you.
So yeah, I just had a small doubt again. Like if I just want to confirm, I understood it. So if we even if we are talking about modern state, we are still including the history and cultural aspects of India as a country, including the pre-colonial state and all different countries, right? So it's all inclusive, even if it's modern Indian.
You have to know, because you know, you speak Gujarati, for example, or Hindi. Now, histories of these languages go far beyond colonial state. They were produced in 15th century, 13th century. Some of the key texts of all these languages are pre-colonial. They were reconfigured, recast in 19th century, reinterpreted in the light of modernity, but they existed before that. Right?
Yes, sir.
Does that help you to understand things better than what?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. And there was a tendency in the Indian left to begin their understanding with 19th century. Strangely, subaltern studies believe that India began in 19th century, but that is not true. Right? Because all the cultural material that Indians used to define themselves is pre-colonial. It is only cooked in a colonial state. Yeah, Khadija, you had some questions.
No, sir, no questions. But I was just saying that as you said that the whole question of Indian literature is a little complex.
Very complex.
I feel yes. So I feel this whole post-colonial and pre-colonial Indian literature, like the separation and then the Pakistani, like in the separation of India and Pakistan, that played a major role in making it complex. Because even today, the songs, there are many common songs that are sung on both the sides, and those songs were written by the writers जो साथ रहते थे before, like जो इंडिया में ही रहते थे, and the whole and even today दोनों साइड पर वो सॉन्ग्स जो हैं वो आज भी बहुत ज्यादा फेमस है. So like the partition has made it more complex, right? I mean,
but if you make distinction between political boundaries and civilizational boundaries, then you will see that political boundaries are far more arbitrary and civilizational boundaries are far more historical. So you may find continuities even with Central Asian cultures, right? Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, or whatever. And there would be, if you go there, then you will find that people eat samosas and whatnot. right? Because all these histories of civilization do not match with political boundaries. Political boundaries are far more fluid. Okay, before 1971, there was no country called Bangladesh. It was East Pakistan. 71 में एक देश नया बना, which is fairly recent. 48 में Israel बना. 47 में India और Pakistan. So you can see that countries, nations as political units are fluid. 30 years ago, Czechoslovakia would be one country. Czech Republic and Slovak, Yugoslav. So nation states are very fluid and historical. Civilizational boundaries and histories are far more complex and old. So what is called Pakistan, you'll find that a lot of Hindi film industry has a big market in Pakistan because of that. Because Hindustani was the language that is commonly understood by Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka. Punjabi is also understood in Pakistan. So Punjabi songs also would be appreciated in Pakistan. Most of the songs today are hardly Hindi, right? They are often Punjabi. So how do you look at these things? Is we have to look beyond political units.
Interestingly, that even though the idea of Bangladesh or Bangladeshi people is very recent, the idea of Israel, despite even though वो बहुत as a country काफी recent है, the idea of Israel and Israelites is so
Goes back to Bible and before Bible.
To surprise someone if you tell them that it is such a new country.
Exactly.
It's surprising.
So civilizational history, yeah. The civilizational history of Israel goes beyond Christianity, right? Almost 2,500 years old, and that was used to create Israel.
And Israelite Jews or Bengali Muslims का सर जो cultural मतलब वो identity है ना कि it's not about being a Muslim but being Bengali speaking Muslim. That उनका भी मतलब similar. It's not just about being an Israelite but being an Israelite Jew with XYZ history attached to us.
Yeah.
That is what is it. Strong.
Yes. So all these are complex histories.
It's not so much about the religion they
Exactly.
follow, but
Exactly. A Bengali Muslim is Bengali first and Muslim later.
yeah, exactly.
Gujarati Muslim is a Gujarati first and Muslim later. Gujarati Christian is Gujarati first and Christian later, right? Because religion occupies certain practices, but language pervades your whole life. Everywhere. So your identity, your linguistic identities are far more, I think, deeply entrenched than religious identities.
And that is why people who might have left Judaism, either to accept Christianity or otherwise, they cannot leave that part of them which follows Hebrew tradition.
And if you look at ancient Christianity before Roman Catholicism, then there were Christians in India before Catholicism started its journey. So they follow a lot of Tamil.
Churches, not very Syrian churches.
They follow a lot of Hindu traditions.
Syro, Malabar, and Syro.
They also, I think, wear this sacred. I don't know.
Because
like
first, when those missionaries arrived, मतलब we believe that Saint Thomas was the first, right? One of the 12 apostles. But इसके अलावा भी जो missionaries आए, they thought that converting or persuading the higher caste would automatically attract the lower caste also.
And would give legitimacy.
But ulta hua. What happened is that the higher caste accepted it and then
Lower
they
caste.
stopped the lower caste
From entering.
That is what happened. And that is why a lot of South Indian Catholics or Christians in general, they
Brahmin,
inculcated this-
Christian Brahmins.
Yes, they are. exactly. They, in some ways, look down upon, let's say, Christians from Chhattisgarh or these tribal areas.
So caste नहीं जाती.
Because not only are they new converts, they are also
Lower caste.
अवर्णा kind, right?
Caste नहीं जाती.
वो नहीं रहा. हाँ मतलब thread का वो तो नहीं, but दूसरा सब everything else.
So
have that
religious,
sense of superiority.
caste, language, region identities,
It's
they
so complicated.
their histories are so complex that it's very difficult to unravel and understand something in isolation. Especially on Indian subcontinent, that is for sure. It's very complex.
And that is why when people, or like let's say the current political climate tries to simplify things now, to draw clear lines, it is so annoying to minorities because they know things are not that simple. आप इतना simple definition दे ही नहीं सकते Indian या Hindu या Muslim का.
Exactly. Impossible.
Not possible. But then they try to draw these black and white lines and.
In India, it gets all the more difficult because you may say you are a Christian and so you believe in Bible, but then it's not. उसके बाद तो real complexity शुरू होती है. So you cannot create a single homogeneous category called Christians in India or Muslims in India. With Hindus, it gets out of hand. So these complexities, yeah, Khadija, go ahead.
So, sir, like this thing always used to confuse me. Once I was visiting a church on Christmas, so they were singing the songs in Gujarati because वो अहमदाबाद का church था, तो I was like गुजराती में क्यों उसको मतलब गा रहे हैं. तो और ये like just as Preeti said कि प्रीति है ना वो.
वही लग
हाँ.
रही है. Confirm करके बात.
तो जैसे उसने बोला कि जो like first you are Gujarati then you are Christian. So अब now it makes sense कि वो लोग गुजराती में they were singing those songs, not in English because it's Gujarat. So ये चीज, and also
Yes.
this thing about this thing about Muslims, it always confuses me, like जैसे there are black Muslims, right, and they are और वो भी like they follow Islam, और फिर इंडिया के मुस्लिम्स हैं, बाहर दूसरी जगह के मुस्लिम्स, इतने सारे अलग अलग लोग हैं and they are following the same religion. It is very complex.
Yeah, ethnicity and religion are complexly interconnected. Means you may follow a common religion called Islam, but ethnic diversity in that is tremendous.
So that is why Malcolm X, I find him so fascinating. Just his political ideologies and otherwise, because most Africans will have this strong tribal culture, right? Most, not all. And at the same time, Islam in itself being such a closed kind of culture. Yet it works. It works for them.
Yes.
How that happens.
Nation of Islam, as they call it. That's the religion that they follow. Yeah, so ethnicities are extremely complex. Yeah, Khadija, you want to say something else?
Yes, sir. So और ऐसा भी हुआ है that there have been so many religions who have been converted. So like
so many. Can you come again?
So many people who have been converted from one religion to another, and then they've been following that since long, और अब उनका religion ही वही बन गया है. So मतलब ये चीज जो है वो इंडिया में like even in our religion it says that we were converted or something, और अभी वही चीज चल रही है. Also
but
some
you
of
know
the
what, I never understood this whole argument that you are a converted Muslim. Who is born a Muslim or Hindu for that matter? Everybody is converted. If you are born in some other family, you would be following some other religion.
Yes, right.
So everybody is converted. Nobody is pure. Right.
Also yes, right. हमारे यहाँ पे एज इन राजस्थान में इतना वो नहीं होता है, जैसे गुजराती का मैंने कहा दैट फर्स्ट दे आर गुजराती एंड देन दे आर क्रिश्चियंस, बट यहाँ पे इतना ज्यादा ये चीज नहीं है. सो इट आल्सो डिपेंड्स अपॉन डिफरेंट स्टेट्स जहाँ पे मतलब हाँ रीजन्स जहाँ पे ज्यादा
रीजनल आइडेंटिटीज आर एक्सट्रीमली पावरफुल.
यस, बट सब जगह नहीं है ना, मतलब
They
कुछ
vary. But
states में
State elections जीतना इतना
Yeah.
difficult रहता है.
so all that complexity called India, we have to take on board if you are going to think of Indian literature or culture. You cannot
Yes.
just borrow what Aristotle said about literature and what Plato said and what Keats said and Byron said, what T.S. Eliot said, or what. You have to take these complexities on board to make sense of Indian cultural processes. Right? You cannot just take anything from your theory book and apply it to Indian literature. So you have to look at what is relevant in Indian context. So theories of translation which are monolingual according to Devi are based on monolingual idea of language itself. So we have to go beyond that and we have to think of translating consciousness. So he says Indian consciousness, crudely put, is a translating consciousness. So our awareness, cultural awareness, ethnic awareness is very multilingual. And we move between various languages in our life, everyday life. So we cannot just accept Western theories of translations blindly. And I think that applies even to literary theories, right? Yeah, so we will stop here for today. So I want you to read and have, if you have more doubts, then we will have further discussion on this in the next class. And if you don't have any doubts, then we can go over to the next essay.